Before we start looking at the novel A Christmas Carol in any detail, it's important to understand the historical context from when it was written. In this lesson, we'll be learning about the class system in the 19th century, what life was like for the working classes, and why Charles Dickens wrote about social injustices during this period of time. So when was A Christmas Carol written? So A Christmas Carol was written in 1843, which was in the 19th century. Just to put this into further context for you, the novel was written 69 years before When an Inspector Calls was set. However, you might find some similarities between the two texts. So in 1843, Queen Victoria was on the throne. This is why this period of time is often referred to as the Victorian era. When analysing A Christmas Carol, you can refer to it being set in the 19th century or the Victorian era. So the 19th century was a capitalist society which was based on a rigid class system. This consisted of four main classes: the working class, the middle class, the upper middle class, and aristocracy, or sometimes referred to as nobility. So during this period of time, there was a large gap between the lifestyle of the working class compared to the middle classes. During this era, 80% of the general population was working class. In order to understand Charles Dickens' main intention when writing the novel, it's important to understand what life was like for the working class during this era. In the 19th century, families tended to be much larger, with up to 10 children or more. Large families were due to the lack of contraception, and children often died young of childhood diseases. As many as 1 in 5 children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Living conditions were often small, damp, and cramped, with no access to clean water. Whole families lived together in only 2 or 3 rooms. Child labour was common for the working classes. There was no benefit system, so young children often had to work to help to support their large family. Children would be sent to work as soon as they were physically able to, with the average age being 10 years old, and some children were as young as 4. Jobs for children would include working in a factory and mines, working as a servant, as chimney sweeps, or selling items on the street. Education was not free, and therefore many children could not read or write. In the first image, you can see a mother here arranging for her child to go to work as a chimney sweeper. The second image shows a young girl selling matches. Match girls would often work from 6 a.m. in the morning on a 12-hour shift and would still only earn enough to have a breakfast and dinner of bread and butter. The Poor Law Amendment Act was introduced in 1834, just 9 years before A Christmas Carol was written. This was designed to support anyone who was out of work or an orphan by allowing them to live in a workhouse. The workhouse was intended to be a deterrent rather than a helpful measure. Therefore, the conditions were deliberately harsh. Families were separated, food was sparse and bland, inmates were crowded together, and they were expected to work long hours doing hard manual tasks such as stone breaking or bone crushing. If you've ever read or watched Oliver Twist, you might remember seeing the workhouse in the opening scene when Oliver asks for more gruel. With no vaccinations, cramped living conditions, and poor access to clean water, diseases such as smallpox, cholera, measles, mumps, rubella, and tuberculosis were rife in the 19th century. The average life expectancy of the middle class was 45, and the working class just half of that. Little was understood about many diseases, with the general belief that disease was caused by miasma, or foul smells. The NHS or free healthcare was not introduced until the 20th century, so the working class could not afford to pay for medicine, treatment, or to see a doctor if they became ill. In comparison, the middle classes lived in great comfort. The middle class were employed in professions such as bankers, shopkeepers, businessmen, and doctors. They owned spacious houses, their children received an education, they could afford medical care, and many had their own servants. Whether your life was middle class or working class was largely left down to chance. It depended on which class you were born into. If a middle-class family lost their income, it was perfectly possible for them to transfer down into the working class. But if you were born in a working-class family, it was impossible to escape poverty due to what was known as the poverty trap. So in the poverty trap, first of all, a child is born into a working-class family. The family has little money, can't afford to feed the child, and therefore there is no option but the child having to go to work. As the child has no education, they can only access low-paid work, which is often unreliable and/or dangerous. The child then grows up in poverty. They can't marry someone who is middle class. That would have been seen as unacceptable during that period of time. They then go on to have a family of their own, and therefore the poverty cycle continues. During this period of time, the working class and the middle class lived entirely separate lives. The middle class believed that the working class were lazy, immoral, or even criminals. The fact that the working classes often had to turn to prostitution or theft in order to survive fueled these speculations. Later in the 19th century, a map was even created by a man called Charles Booth to demonstrate where the different classes lived in London. You can see by the key here that the lowest class, which are highlighted in black, are labelled as being vicious or semi-criminal. Charles Dickens was known as a social reformer. He wanted to see an end to this suffering of the working classes. Charles himself was no stranger to poverty. He was born in 1817 into a middle-class family and received a good standard of education. However, in 1824, his father, who was a clerk in the Navy, was sent to prison for getting into debt. As a result, Dickens spent a short amount of time in a factory working alongside the working classes. It is without any doubt that this experience helped to shape his views on social injustice and helped to influence his writing. As only the middle classes and aristocracy could read, Charles Dickens targeted this audience through his literature. His main aim was to educate the reader and spark a debate on what life was really like for the working classes. He wrote a number of novels on the theme of social injustice, such as Oliver Twist, A Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations, and A Christmas Carol. Dickens is largely accredited to giving a voice to the working class, which helped to bring about social reform during the Victorian era. So, how is this context demonstrated in A Christmas Carol? Well, firstly, we have the class system being represented by some of the main characters. Scrooge represents the upper middle classes. He owns a counting house business called Scrooge and Marley. This would have been a 19th century equivalent of an accountant or a bookkeeper. We also know that his recently deceased business partner, Jacob Marley, would also have belonged to the affluent middle classes. Scrooge also owns a large house with empty rooms. There is no mention of any servants. In the opening chapter, we see his attitude towards the working class when a gentleman asks him if he will donate to the poor, and Scrooge replies with, "Are there no workhouses? Are there no prisons?" which reflects the upper middle class's opinions of the working class. Scrooge is also able to employ a clerk called Bob Cratchit, who would be classed as a middle class due to his occupation. However, as Scrooge underpays him, he is presented as being poor. The family's clothes are old and ill-fitting. They can only afford a goose at Christmas, and if they can't pay the medical expenses of their ill son, Tiny Tim, he is likely to die. There is also reference to the oldest child, Martha, having to work in a shop.